Hey everyone, welcome back. We've been talking a lot lately about making learning stick, like how to really get stuff to sink in.
Yeah, it's a challenge we all face.
Totally. And we've had some really great listener questions and comments about it. So for today's deep dive, we're digging into a fascinating article called Five Strategies for Optimizing Instructional Materials.
Oh, that's a good one. It's packed with practical insights.
It really is. We're going to unpack it and pull out the most actionable strategies, the stuff you can actually start using right away to learn more effectively.
That's the goal. Because let's face it, traditional learning materials, textbooks, lectures, online courses, sometimes they're not designed in a way that really works with how our brains actually learn.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's where this article and this deep dive come in, because it's all based on some really powerful ideas about cognition, like cognitive load theory and the cognitive theory of multimedia learning.
Right. These theories give us a framework for understanding how we process information and, more importantly, how we can avoid overloading our mental capacity. It's like understanding the limits of your computer's RAM. If you try to run too many programs at once, it's going to slow down or crash.
Oh, yeah, the dreaded spinning wheel of death.
Exactly. Our brains work in a similar way. Cognitive load theory is all about managing that mental workload so we can learn effectively. And then the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, it helps us understand how to present information, especially combining visuals and words in a way that makes it easier for our brains to absorb and remember.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the article. It basically breaks down five common problems that can make learning materials less effective, and then it offers solutions for each one. First up, what do you do when you're faced with a wall of text? Think about those textbooks that are just dense paragraphs for pages, or lectures where it's bullet point after bullet point.
Yeah, I remember those days. Just information overload.
It's exhausting, right? And the problem here is that when you're only dealing with text, your brain has to work overtime to create its own mental images and try to organize the information. It's like you're having to be your own illustrator on top of trying to understand the concepts.
It's incredibly demanding on your working memory, which is that limited capacity mental workspace where we hold and process information.
Exactly. So what can instructors do about this? Well, the article highlights the multimedia principle, which suggests that adding visuals to text-heavy materials can make a huge difference. Think diagrams, illustrations, anything that helps make the information more concrete.
It's about providing those mental scaffolding, those visual anchors that people can use to organize the information.
I like that, like visual hooks to hang the ideas on, and the research really supports this. A study by Butcher back in 2006 looked at students learning about the circulatory system, and the students who were given text and graphics together, they were able to understand the concepts better and make more accurate inferences compared to students who only had text.
It's really powerful. Instead of having to build that understanding from scratch using only words, the visuals provide a structure that you can immediately grasp. Think about trying to describe something complex, like the structure of a cell or a molecule. It's so much easier to understand if you can see a diagram of it.
Oh, absolutely. A picture's worth 1,000 words, as they say. But what if you're stuck with a textbook or a lecture that's just text?
That's where you, as the learner, can step in and take charge. One of the most effective strategies is to generate your own visuals.
Okay, so like sketching a diagram or creating a concept map.
Exactly. And there's a cognitive model that explains why this is so effective. The cognitive model of drawing construction, or CMDC. It basically says that when you draw what you're learning, you're not just passively absorbing information, you're actively engaging with it.
So you're forced to think about it more deeply.
Exactly. You have to select the key ideas from the text, organize them spatially, and connect them to what you already know. It's a much more active and meaningful way of processing the information. And there's research to back this up. Van Meter, back in 2001, found that students who drew while learning were more likely to monitor their understanding. They were more aware of whether they were actually getting it or not.
That makes sense. You're constantly checking if your drawing actually reflects what you're reading. But I have to admit, I'm not the most artistic person. Are there any downsides to this approach?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that drawing does take time. And if you're not careful, your drawings might not be completely accurate, especially if you're dealing with something very technical. Fiorella and Zhang in 2018 pointed out that sometimes students can get bogged down in the details of drawing and lose sight of the bigger picture.
Okay, so it's not a magic bullet.
Right. But research also shows that you can make drawing much more effective by providing some support. Things like partially completed diagrams or opportunities to compare your drawing to a correct example and make revisions, these can make a big difference. Schmeck, Gagne, and others have done a lot of research on this, and even Van Meter's earlier work showed the value of giving students a chance to check their drawings against a model.
So even if you don't think you're the next Picasso, the act of trying to sketch out the main points can be a really powerful way to learn from text-heavy material, especially if you have some guidance along the way. Okay, let's move on to the second problem. This is one that I think everyone has experienced at some point. When the text and the visuals that go with it are like miles apart. You're reading a paragraph on page 20, and then the diagrams are referring to is all the way back on page 5.
Ugh, the worst. Flipping back and forth constantly.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah.
And it's actually not just annoying, it's cognitively demanding. It creates what's called the split attention effect.
Yes, your mental desk gets completely cluttered because you're constantly switching your focus back and forth between the text and the visual, trying to hold all those pieces in your mind at once. It takes up so much mental energy that could be spent on actually understanding the material. Ayers and Sweller's work really highlighted how inefficient this is. Back in 1997, Mayer showed how presenting information in this separated way actually led to poorer learning outcomes compared to integrating it.
It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces are scattered all over the room.
Perfect analogy. So how can instructors prevent this? The solution here is the spatial contiguity principle, which basically says, keep related text and visuals close together, ideally right next to each other or even integrated, like labels directly on a diagram.
Makes sense. So less page flipping, more mental clarity.
Exactly. And the research backs this up. We've got meta-analyses by Jins in 2006 and Schroeder and Shengshi in 2018. They looked at tons of studies across different subjects, and the evidence is clear. Integrated formats lead to better learning, whether you're talking about math, biology, history. It just works.
Okay, so instructors need to keep things together. But again, what can you do if you're stuck with materials that don't follow this principle?
Well, if you have a physical copy, you can try to create that spatial contiguity yourself. Literally cut and paste text labels closer to the parts of the diagram they refer to. You can even just use your finger to physically trace the connections between the text and the visual. Agostino and Gordon and Mackin and Jins have done some interesting research on this, showing that even simple physical actions can help your brain link the information. And Korbach's work with touchscreens has shown similar benefits when people can interact directly with the material.
I like those ideas. It's like you're building a bridge between the separate pieces of information.
Exactly. Now, if you're working with digital materials, things can be trickier. But de Koning and colleagues have done some fascinating research suggesting that mental strategies can be really helpful here. Just mentally imagining the text moving to the corresponding part of the visual can actually make a difference.
Wait, really? Just picturing it in your mind.
It sounds a bit strange, but it works. De Koning's 2020 research even found that this mental integration can be just as effective as physically moving the text or having the instructor present it in an integrated format. Bodemer and Faust also had interesting findings along these lines. So if you can't physically rearrange the material, try to actively visualize those connections in your mind.
That's incredibly empowering. It means even if the layout isn't ideal, you can take action to make it work better for your brain. Okay, let's tackle problem number 3. Redundant or non-essential information. This is when the material repeats the same information in multiple ways, or it just includes a lot of extra details that aren't really necessary to understand the main points.
Right, you might think that more information is always better, but that's not how our brains work. It's about quality, not quantity.
Exactly. And in cognitive psychology terms, this overload of information increases what's called extraneous cognitive load. It's mental clutter that distracts you from focusing on what's truly important, which is the germane load. Kaluga and Sweller have really emphasized this distinction. They've shown how redundancy, which is when you can understand one source without needing the other, can hinder learning. If you need both the text and the visual to understand, then it's not considered redundant. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. All that extra stuff just makes it harder to focus on the key point.
Exactly. So the solution here is simple. Instructors need to be ruthless about removing non-essential information. Cut out the fluff, the overly detailed examples that don't really add anything new.
Less is more.
Absolutely. And a classic study by Chandler and Sweller back in 1991 really illustrates this. They were looking at how people learn about blood flow, and what they found was that students actually learned best from just the diagrams alone. The accompanying text was actually redundant and made it harder to learn.
Interesting. So sometimes the visuals are all you need?
It depends on the material, of course, but the principle holds true. Mayer has done a lot of work on this as well, showing how having identical text on the screen and someone reading it aloud at the same time actually hinders learning because it creates redundancy. And back in 1996, he found that overly detailed lessons on lightning actually led to poorer understanding compared to more concise explanations.
Okay, so sometimes instructors need to be less verbose and more visual. But what if you're the learner and you're stuck with material that has all this extra stuff in it? How can you deal with that?
One of the most effective strategies is to generate your own concise summaries. This could be written summaries or visual summaries like concept maps or diagrams. The act of summarizing forces you to really think about what's essential and to reorganize the information in a more streamlined way. And this ties into something called generative learning theory, which highlights the importance of actively constructing your own understanding.
So you're basically filtering out the redundancy yourself.
Exactly. And there's good evidence for this approach. Bretzing and Kohlhavi, back in 1979, found that students who summarized text remembered it better than those who just copied it verbatim.
That's pretty convincing.
It is, but it's worth acknowledging that summarizing effectively can be tricky, especially without some guidance. If you're not sure what's truly essential, you might miss key points in your summary. That's where creating visual summaries can be particularly helpful, especially for complex information. Bumek and Tversky and Leopold and Leutner have some interesting work on this, showing how visual summaries can help you see the big picture and the relationships between concepts more clearly.
So sometimes a diagram or a mind map can be the best way to condense and clarify complex information. Okay, let's move on to problem number 4. When learning material doesn't effectively highlight what's important, it's like being given a map where all the roads are the same thickness and color. You can't tell the main highways from the side streets.
It can be so frustrating. You're left wondering, what am I supposed to be focusing on here?
And cognitively, this lack of emphasis makes your working memory work harder because it has to constantly scan and sort through the information to figure out what deserves the most attention. This is where the signaling principle comes in, as described by Van Gogh.
Right. And there are actually two main ways that instructors can use signaling. They can add things to the material, like arrows, boxes, underlining, different colors, anything that visually draws attention to the key points. This helps to guide the learner's attention and reduce cognitive load.
So it's about making the important stuff stand out.
Exactly. And research by Lin and Atkinson and Liu and others has shown how effective this can be. Even using gestures with a pedagogical agent, like having an animated character point to something on the screen, can help, as Wang and Cook have found.
That's interesting. It's like having a virtual guide pointing out what to focus on.
Exactly. Now, the other way to use signaling is to actually remove things. It's about creating contrast or using visual techniques like spotlights or zooming in to make the important information pop out without adding more visual clutter.
So less can be more in this case, too.
Exactly. And researchers like de Koning, Amadou, Oslick, and Jamet have done a lot of work exploring these techniques. But it's also important to be careful about adding too many signals because, as Castro, Alonso, and Schroeder have shown, that can sometimes be counterproductive. Like, if there's too much going on visually, it can actually become distracting. You know, all those extra hand gestures and animations, they can be more confusing than helpful.
Yeah, I've seen those. Sometimes it's like a hand-waving frenzy.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where the signals guide attention without creating more cognitive load.
So instructors need to be strategic about how they use signaling. But as learners, what can we do if the material we're working with doesn't do a good job of highlighting what's important?
Well, one of the most common and effective learner-managed strategies is underlining or highlighting key information in text. And as Miyatsu and others have pointed out, highlighting serves two main purposes. First, it helps you store the information more effectively, making it easier to find later when you're reviewing. And second, it has a generative function. The act of deciding what to highlight forces you to think critically about the text and identify what's truly important.
So it's a 2-for-1 deal.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research supporting the benefits of highlighting. Studies by Blanchard, Fowler, Rickards, and Yu have all shown that it can improve learning. But there's a catch. As Donlowski and Miyatsu's work has shown, a lot of students don't highlight very effectively.
Oh, that makes sense. I remember just highlighting everything when I was in school.
Yeah, a lot of us have been there. But the good news is that, as Amer and Leutner have shown, even a brief training session can significantly improve how well people use highlighting. It's really about being selective and strategic. And the same principles can apply to visual materials. Schlag and Plutzner suggest that you can use similar marking techniques to emphasize key parts of diagrams or images.
So it's not just about mindlessly running a highlighter across the page. It's about making deliberate choices.
Hmm.
Okay, let's tackle our final problem for this deep dive. Dealing with material that shows too much transient information. This is a fancy way of saying that things are moving too fast on the screen.
Right. Think about fast-paced animations or videos where information flashes by before you've had a chance to process it. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
And it's called the transient information effect. Ayers and Paz and Castrolonzo and colleagues have done some interesting research on this. Essentially, it happens when your working memory gets overloaded because there's too much visual information changing too rapidly. You can't keep up.
It's like trying to watch a movie and fast forward.
Exactly. So what can instructors do to prevent this cognitive overload?
The key principle here is segmenting, which means breaking down those fast-paced visuals into smaller chunks with pauses in between. This gives the learner time to absorb and process each piece of information before moving on to the next.
So pacing is everything.
It really is. And Beard's 2018 study on learning medical procedures from videos is a great example. He found that students learned much better from videos that were segmented compared to videos that played straight through. But, as Kirby and Zaks and Boltz have pointed out, the way you segment the information is crucial. You can't just chop it up randomly. The breaks need to occur at natural points in the flow of information, at those points where one idea or concept ends and another begins.
So it's like creating mangled paragraphs or chapters.
Exactly. Schwann's work on camera angles has even suggested that visual cues, like a change in camera angle, can help signal these natural breaks to the learner.
Interesting. So instructors need to be thoughtful about how they pace visual information. But as learners, what can we do when we encounter material that's just too fast?
The best learner-managed solution is to simply take control of the pace yourself. If you're watching a video online, use the pause button liberally. Rewind if you need to. If you're looking at an animation, see if there are controls to slow down the speed or to advance through it step by step.
So take your time and don't be afraid to hit the pause button.
Exactly. And research supports this approach. Stiller, Hoffler, and Hatzidimitris have all found that giving learners control over the pace can improve learning outcomes. But it's worth noting that, as Hatzidimitris and Kalyuga found, it's often the learners who are newer to a topic who benefit the most from pace control. They're the ones who might need those extra pauses to really process the information. However, these learners might also need some initial guidance on how to use those controls effectively.
So knowing when to pause and how long to pause for that might be a skill in itself. Which brings us back to something we talked about earlier, the expertise factor. We've talked about all these great strategies, both what instructors can do to optimize learning materials and what learners can do to actively manage their own learning process. But how do you know which approach is going to be most effective for you, given your current level of knowledge on a topic?
That's a great question. And this is where the idea of the expertise reversal effect comes in. It's been researched by Chen, Kaluga, and others, and it basically means that what works best for a novice learner might not work best for someone who's more experienced with the topic. And it connects back to that idea of generative learning. Learners benefit most when they're actively involved in constructing their own understanding.
So a beginner might benefit more from having the instructor do some of that cognitive work for them by providing well-structured materials, clear visuals, and strong signaling.
Exactly. But as the learner becomes more knowledgeable, they might benefit more from taking a more active role in organizing and integrating the information themselves. And the research comparing these instructor-led and learner-managed approaches often shows this pattern.
That makes a lot of sense. Can you give us some examples of how this plays out with the 5 strategies we've been discussing?
Sure. Let's start with the multimedia principle, adding visuals to text. Some studies, like Van Meter's early work, found that getting students to generate their own drawings could be very effective, especially when they had some guidance and feedback. But other studies, like those by Leopold and colleagues, found that this could actually be too much for novice learners. It could overload their working memory because they're still trying to grasp the basic concepts.
So starting with instructor-provided visuals might be better for beginners.
In many cases, yes. And Zhang and Fiorella came up with a really interesting combined approach. They had novice learners generate their own visuals, and then they had them compare their drawings to instructor-provided visuals and revise them. This seemed to be a really effective way to support those learners who were just starting out.
That's a neat idea. combining the benefits of both approaches. What about the split attention effect, where the text and visuals are separated?
Again, we see this expertise reversal effect in the research. Agostinho and de Koning, in their work, found that for novice learners, having the instructor integrate the text and visuals was more effective. But other studies like Sitholes and Rudenries suggested that more experienced learners could benefit from actively trying to integrate the information themselves, especially when the material was more complex, as Bottomer's research showed. Interestingly, de Kloning's later research found that even mentally integrating the information could be just as effective as having it physically integrated, especially for those with more expertise.
Okay, so it's not always clear-cut. It really depends on the learner's level. What about dealing with redundant information? Does expertise play a role there?
The research on this is still a bit mixed. Marisa's work, for instance, didn't find a big difference between having instructors remove redundancy and teaching learners how to identify and ignore it themselves. But the way learners are taught to manage that redundancy might make a difference. In Idle's study, which looked at redundancy in combination with signaling, the findings were mixed. It seems like how well learners can handle redundancy on their own might depend on the specific strategies they use, their prior knowledge, and how good they are at figuring out what's truly unnecessary.
So more research is needed there. What about signaling, highlighting what's important? Does it always help?
It's interesting because you might think that making the important stuff stand out would always be beneficial, but that's not always the case. While early work by Fowler and Rickards found that learners who highlighted text themselves performed better, more recent research, like the studies by Colliet and Jamet on outlining and Stoll and Mayer's work on graphic organizers, has suggested that for certain types of learning, especially when you need to apply the information in new situations, having the instructor provide those signals might be more effective. It could be that knowing what to highlight or emphasize is a key skill that novice learners haven't developed yet, and that instructors can provide that initial guidance.
That's a really interesting point. So it's not just about making things stand out. It's about knowing what deserves to stand out. And finally, what about those fast-paced visuals? Does expertise matter there?
Ray did a really comprehensive meta-analysis in 2019 looking at lots of different studies, and his findings suggest that for improving retention, actually remembering the information, the instructor-led approach of segmenting the visuals is generally more effective than just giving learners control over the pace. This might be because, as we discussed earlier, novice learners don't always make the best choices about when to pause or how to break down the information effectively.
So sometimes a little bit of structure is helpful, especially when you're starting out.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer to the question of how to best optimize learning materials. It really depends on the learner's level of expertise, the complexity of the material, and the specific strategies being used. As you become more knowledgeable in a particular area, you'll probably find that taking a more active role in your learning process, using those learner-managed strategies, becomes increasingly beneficial. But when you're first starting out, well-designed materials with clear visuals, effective signaling, and a good pace can provide the support you need to get a solid foundation.
That's such a great point. It's about finding the right balance of support and challenge. Okay, let's do a quick recap of the 5 key strategies we've covered today. First, we talked about combining words and visuals whenever possible, using the multimedia principle.
Right. It's about giving your brain multiple ways to engage with the information.
Second, we discussed the importance of spatial contiguity, keeping related text and visuals close together to avoid that split attention effect.
It's about reducing mental clutter and making it easier for your brain to connect the dots.
Third, we tackled the issue of redundancy and non-essential information, emphasizing the need to focus on what's truly important and to cut out the fluff.
Quality over quantity when it comes to learning materials.
Fourth, we explored the power of signaling, highlighting, or emphasizing key information to guide the learner's attention and reduce cognitive load.
It's about making sure the important stuff stands out.
And finally, we discussed the importance of pacing, especially when it comes to fast-paced visuals, using segmenting to break down the information into manageable chunks.
It's about giving your brain time to catch up and process everything.
And for each of these strategies, we talked about both instructor-managed solutions, things that teachers or course designers can do to optimize the materials, and learner-managed solutions, things that you, as the learner, can do to take control of your own learning process.
And remembering that expertise reversal effect is crucial. When you're a beginner, you might benefit more from well-structured materials that do some of the cognitive work for you. But as you gain more knowledge and experience, actively engaging in those learner-managed strategies can really help you deepen your understanding and make the learning stick.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a challenge. The next time you're learning something new, think about these 5 strategies. What's one thing you can do differently to make the material work better for your brain? Think about a time when you felt overwhelmed or frustrated while trying to learn something. Could any of these strategies have helped you in that situation? We encourage you to experiment and see what works best for you. Thanks for joining us today.